The late summer sun blazed down on the quiet suburban neighborhood, its rays bouncing off freshly paved driveways and neatly trimmed lawns. On the surface, it looked like the perfect postcard of American middle-class life, the kind of community where children rode their bikes in cul-de-sacs and retirees waved from their porches while sipping iced tea. But beneath that glossy exterior lurked a storm of tension, one that was about to break in ways no one in the community could have imagined. Marcus Holloway had lived in this neighborhood with his wife, Angela, for just under a year. To most people, he was simply the quiet, well-built man who jogged every morning at sunrise and kept his yard impeccably maintained. He didn't socialize much with the other residents, though it wasn't out of arrogance. It was just who he was, reserved, observant, and content to keep to himself. Angela, on the other hand, was warm and approachable, the kind of woman who always had a smile for the mailman and who had already baked cookies for several of their neighbors. They had chosen this community because it promised peace, order, and safety. Marcus had spent years serving his country, enduring grueling deployments and surviving hostile environments. After retiring as a Navy SEAL, all he wanted was stability and a place where Angela could feel safe, where they could build a quiet life free from the chaos he had left behind. But what they hadn't realized was that the Homeowners Association, the HOA, ran the neighborhood like a private fiefdom. It started with small notices in their mailbox. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A warning about the color of their shutters being slightly outside the HOA's approved palette. A note about their trash cans being visible for a few hours longer than allowed on pickup day. A reminder that the lawn should be trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches, not the slightly uneven 3 Marcus had left after his last mow. Angela laughed at the absurdity of it all. These people need hobbies, she had said, rolling her eyes as she crumpled up yet another notice. Marcus had simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't tell her that he had already begun to notice a pattern. The HOA didn't send these nitpicking complaints to every homeowner. No, it seemed as though the Holloways were being singled out. Marcus had endured far worse things than petty letters. But what bothered him wasn't the rules, it was the undertone. The way the HOA enforcers lingered outside their property, staring a moment too long. The way some neighbors avoided eye contact. The way the HOA president, a smug man named Richard Callahan, had once said with a forced grin, "We just want to make sure everyone here knows how to fit in." Marcus knew what that meant. He had lived long enough, fought long enough, to recognize the veiled hostility behind polite words. But he didn't want to burden Angela with it, so he kept his observations to himself, quietly making sure their home complied with every ridiculous regulation, quietly ensuring that no one would have legitimate cause to complain. Yet no matter how perfectly they followed the rules, the notices kept coming. The breaking point came one Thursday afternoon when Angela was outside planting flowers along the walkway. It was her escape, her therapy. The bright colors, the scent of fresh soil, it grounded her in a way nothing else could. She was kneeling in the dirt, humming softly to herself, when a white SUV pulled up in front of their house. Out stepped 2 men wearing reflective vests with HOA enforcement printed on them in bold black letters. They were both in their 40s, stocky, with the kind of demeanor that screamed authority, even if that authority was self-appointed. "Ma'am," one of them called out, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "You're in violation of HOA landscaping regulations." Angela stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Excuse me?" she asked, genuinely confused. The man jabbed a finger toward the flower bed. "Those flowers aren't on the approved list for front yard vegetation. You were notified in last month's HOA bulletin." Angela frowned. "These are just marigolds. They're common, harmless. Doesn't matter," the second man interrupted, stepping closer. "Rules are rules. You'll need to remove them immediately or face a fine." Angela tried to keep her composure, though frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior. "With all due respect, I've reviewed the guidelines. It doesn't say anything about marigolds. I'm not removing them just because you say so." The first man smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "That's not how this works. We enforce the rules. You follow them. Simple as that." Angela's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "You don't get to intimidate me on my own property. If you have an issue, take it up with my husband." The mention of Marcus's name seemed to make them pause for a moment, exchanging a look before the smirk returned. "We've seen your husband," the second man said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Big guy, always keeping to himself. But he's not here now, is he?" Something in his voice made Angela's skin crawl. She took a step back toward the porch, but the men moved forward, closing the distance. Their presence was no longer about flowers or rules. It was about power, about control, about putting her in her place. "I think you should leave," Angela said firmly, her voice louder now, hoping a neighbor might hear. Instead, the first man's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Or what? You gonna call the cops? Tell them the HOA is doing its job." When Angela didn't respond, the second man reached out, snatching one of the freshly planted marigolds from the soil and tossing it onto the walkway. "Consider this your final warning." Angela's stomach clenched. She could feel the situation slipping from uncomfortable to dangerous, but before she could retreat, the first man suddenly shoved her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to send a clear message. Her breath caught, her heart thundered in her chest. And for the first time since they had moved here, Angela felt unsafe in her own front yard. What the men didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Marcus was not the kind of man who tolerated threats to his family. He wasn't just a quiet neighbor with a nice lawn. He was a retired Navy SEAL who had spent years neutralizing dangers far more lethal than two overconfident HOA enforcers. And he was standing less than 30 yards away, watching everything unfold. Marcus had returned from his jog earlier than usual and had paused at the corner, hidden from view, when he saw the SUV pull up. He hadn't intervened immediately, choosing instead to observe. Old habits died hard. He wanted to see how far these men would push, wanted to know the extent of their intentions. But the moment one of them laid a hand on Angela, something primal ignited inside him. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. His calm, measured demeanor melted away, replaced by the sharp edge of a man who had been trained to respond decisively to threats. His breathing slowed, his vision narrowed, and the world seemed to quiet around him. To the men, Angela was just a woman they thought they could intimidate. To Marcus, she was everything. His wife, his anchor, his reason for choosing peace over war. And now, they had crossed the line. As he stepped forward, the sun glinting off the sweat on his shoulders, his shadow stretched long across the lawn. The enforcers didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their intimidation. But when Angela's eyes suddenly darted past them, widening with relief, they turned, and froze. Marcus's presence was like a storm rolling in. Silent, heavy, undeniable. His 6'2" frame radiated controlled power, his eyes cold and unblinking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, and in that instant, the enforcers realized they had made a grave mistake.